Welcome to week 9 of Humanities 101M. So we're a little bit over the halfway point now, so that should feel good. You guys really put in your work last week learning about Roman history. The good news is we get to kind of take a break from history for a little bit. This week will be really all about Roman literature. The next week, Roman art and philosophy and so on. We'll be making reference to some of the history you studied last week, so there will be payoffs to learning all that history, but we can just enjoy the literature this week. And really, it's all about the Aeneid. We're going to read a little bit more Roman literature next week, but this week you've got your hands full with the Aeneid, as well as the Roman literature lecture from Dr. Edmondson. The Aeneid is a story unlike the Odyssey, a story about finding a new home. The Odyssey was a story about homecoming, as you know. The Aeneid is different. The Aeneid asks the question, where do you go when you can't go home again? And in a way, it's asking an even bigger question, a question that probably will face all of us at some point in our lives. How can you honor the past? How can you honor your heritage, but sort of embrace a new future for yourself? That's the kind of question the Aeneid is interested in. We'll see when we read Beowulf a little later how that poem is also very much interested in that question of how do you honor the past while at the same time leaving it behind in a certain sense. Now, that's a kind of perennial, enduring human question that people are always going to grapple with. But if you think about Virgil's own historical context, Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, if you think about his historical context, you can really understand why this question was pressing on him. His dates are 70 to 19 BCE, so he dies shortly before the birth of Christ. And because you've studied Roman history last week, you know what a tumultuous period of time this was over the course of Virgil's lifetime. He lived through intense and rapid change. He lived through 3 of the 4 civil wars that bedeviled the Roman Republic during that century. And he lived long enough to see the transition from the Republic to the Empire, the Principate of Caesar Augustus. And you can imagine what kind of question this would raise for Virgil and other Romans. How do you honor the Republican past of Rome when there's no real way to bring that back? Rome has shifted into a very different form of government. So how can we embrace the present and the future, but continue to honor the past in some way? Now, I want to say a little bit about how the Aeneid came to be written in the first place. Virgil had the most powerful patron imaginable. It was Caesar Augustus himself, aka Octavian, who commissioned Virgil to write this epic. But what Augustus initially had in mind is very different than what you're going to read. Augustus wanted Virgil to write a Homeric style epic about himself, that is, Augustus. And so really let's face it, he was asking Virgil to write a kind of piece of propaganda for him. But the project ended up moving in a very different direction. If you think about Homer, and we haven't read the Iliad, maybe some of you have. The Iliad, of course, is written about the Trojan War, the Greeks versus the Trojans. It's written by Homer, who's a Greek. But despite that fact, Homer really pays tribute to the Trojans. They are seen as worthy foes, and their great warriors like Hector are seen as just as great in their own way as Achilles. Now, if Virgil were to write an epic about Augustus in a Homeric style, that's going to cause problems because one of the central moments of an epic about Augustus would have to be the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. This is the final civil war. This is the one where Octavian defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And as you know, Octavian absolutely hated Mark Antony's guts. So Virgil didn't really want to write an epic about Augustus because if he was really going to do it in Homeric style, he would really honor and pay tribute to Augustus's enemy as well, Mark Antony, and Augustus probably would not have cared too much for that. So Virgil has a brilliant idea that yes, he's going to write an epic that's about Augustus indirectly, but directly, immediately, he was going to write an epic about the ancient Roman past, but write it in such a way that it's also very much a commentary on the present and future of Rome. So that's what he does. So one of the things you'll want to do as you read is look for places where Virgil is paying tribute to his patron Augustus. Now, the events that take place in the Aeneid took place 1,000 years before the time of Augustus. But Virgil finds ways, sometimes not terribly subtle ways, to glorify his patron. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. One thing that can be a little bit confusing about the Aeneid is that Aeneas has a son, but the son goes by two different names. Sometimes he's called Ascanius, and sometimes he's called Iulus, I-U-L-U-S, and that's the name I want to focus on, Iulus. Well, Iulus is supposed to be the founder of the clan of the Julii, a very famous Roman family, a Roman family that produced Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar was, of course, the great uncle of Octavian, the future Augustus. And actually, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, after he was assassinated, Octavian adopted his great uncle's name and called himself Caesar. So basically what Virgil is saying here is that Octavian can trace his ancestry, or I should say, because he's Augustus at this point, Augustus can trace his ancestry all the way back to the founder of the Roman people themselves, the founder himself, that is Aeneas. Okay, so there's one way that we see a little love shown to Augustus. But let me also point out a passage from very early on in the work. So go ahead and get your copy of the Aeneid out. Look at page 9. If you have a different edition, it's book 1, right around line 286. Now, what's happening here is that Jupiter is giving a speech in which he's predicting all the great things that will happen to Aeneas's descendants. So here's what he says, starting around line 286. The noble Trojan line will give us Caesar, a Julian name passed down from the great Iulus, with worldwide empire, glory heaven high. At ease you will receive him with his burden of eastern plunder. Mortals will send him prayers here. Then wars will end, cruel history grow gentle. Vesta, old faith, and Quirinus is another name for Romulus, with Remus, his twin, will make the laws. Tight locks of iron will close war's grim gates. Inside, godless furor, drooling blood on a heap of brutal weapons, will roar against the chains that pinion him. Okay, so there's going to be this great figure. He is going to put an end to wars. He is going to usher in an era of peace. He will also be worshipped as a god. Notice that line, mortals will send him prayers here. Now, he's referred to as Caesar here, so your first instinct may be to say, oh, well, this is Julius Caesar. But that can't be right. We know this can't be right because Julius Caesar did not usher in an era of peace. In fact, there are 2 civil wars that take place after his death. So the reference here is, in fact, to Augustus Caesar, aka Octavian. Okay, so right in the opening pages of the epic, Virgil is finding a way to honor his patron. So be looking for places where Virgil does this. All right, I want to say a little bit about genre. I've already let the cat out of the bag. It is an epic that we're dealing with. It's the first of 4 epics. I'm sorry, the second of 4 epics that we will read in this course. Of course, we've already read the Odyssey. That's our first epic. So I know you already know what an epic is. Let me just refresh you a bit. It's a long narrative poem, of course. There's often a quest or a battle involved. It needs to be a hero or maybe even a group of heroes. And last but not least, epics are meant to communicate the values of an entire culture or nation. And we've seen this. You wrote about this for the Odyssey, right? How the Odyssey kind of crystallizes Greek cultural values. So the Aeneid most certainly fits the bill. Now, this is not the first Latin epic. Of course, Latin is the language of the Romans, so that's the language that Virgil wrote in. This is not the first, but it is undoubtedly the most important and the greatest. And I should say that this is an excellent example of a phenomenon that you read about in West in the World and that I talked about in a previous video. That is the Hellenization of Roman culture. Okay? So here we have Virgil, the greatest Roman poet of his generation, and who is his model in writing the Aeneid? Is it some other Roman? No, it is not. It is the Greek Homer. Okay, and we'll talk a lot today about some of those Homeric traits. So let's go ahead and say a little bit about that, starting with the structure. Okay, the Odyssey was written in 24 books. This is written in 12, but there's still very much a Homeric design here, because the 12 books of the Aeneid can be very neatly divided into 2 sections, books 1 through 6 and books 7 through 12. Books 1 through 6, and we'll be reading from those books. Books 1 through 6, very clearly modeled on the Odyssey. You've got the hero, he's traveling around, he's going to exotic lands, he's away from home. And then in books 7 through 12, which we're not going to read, but I'll say a little bit about, books 7 through 12, those are the books of war, where we see Aeneas, the warrior, in action. And those books are accordingly very much modeled on Homer's The Iliad. So even the design is Homeric. The subject matter, of course, is Homeric because the whole story is about what happens to Aeneas after the Trojan War ends, just like the Odyssey is all about what happens to Odysseus after the end of the Trojan War. But of course, neither epic actually begin at the beginning. So neither epic actually begins at Troy. Both epics begin in medias res, in the middle of the thing. So when we first meet Aeneas, he's not fleeing Troy. No. He's just been shipwrecked on the coast of Libya. He's already been wandering for 7 years. So very much like the opening of the Odyssey, the difference being that we meet Aeneas right away, whereas there's that delay in the Odyssey. There are extensive flashbacks that we get in the form of storytelling. That's something very familiar from the Odyssey. We're going to see it again in the Aeneid. I've already mentioned the fact that Jupiter gave a speech. Just like in the Odyssey, we're going to see the gods become really involved in the plot of the story. That'll be very familiar. Um, and be asking yourself, make sure you understand, and you should understand this really by the end of book one, why it is that Venus is so intent to protect Aeneas and why Juno is so hostile. So be looking for that. But not only do we have gods involved, we have gods doing very much the same sorts of things they were doing in the Odyssey. They are appearing in disguise. They are disguising the heroes by enveloping them in a dark mist. And we saw that with Odysseus. You're going to see it again with Aeneas. There are epic similes as well, epic similes, long, complicated similes, and lots of other subtle echoes. There's a really poignant moment when Aeneas goes into the underworld in book 6. He sees his wife. He tries to embrace her 3 times, but 3 times he is unable to actually make contact. And if you're reading that and you're thinking, gosh, this sounds really familiar, that's because this is taken right out of the Odyssey, book 19, where Odysseus goes into the underworld, sees his mother, tries to embrace her 3 times, 3 times is unable to do so. So the Homeric fingerprints are just everywhere in this story. All right, the last thing I want to do in this video is talk a little bit about what we're not reading so you don't feel lost. We're reading books 1 and 2, and then skipping 3, read 4, skip 5, and read 6. This is all in the syllabus and on Canvas. Obviously, if you want to read books 3 and 5, that's great. I'm not forbidding you, but it's not required. So what exactly happens in book 3? I encourage you to print out or at least consult the map that I put on Canvas for this week. The map will show you the course of Aeneas's wanderings. And so book 3 is kind of picking up after Troy has been destroyed and Aeneas has fled and he's trying to start a new life somewhere, but he's not sure where to go. So there's a whole series of false starts. He goes to Thrace, he goes to Crete, but it's just not working out. All the signs indicate that he is not really meant to settle down in any of these places. Now, there is a piece of information that he gleans in this book that I think is worth knowing. At one point, that the household gods, idols, that he sort of sneaks out of Troy, they actually speak to Aeneas. And they tell him something he didn't know. They tell him that Dardanus, D-A-R-D-A-N-U-S, Dardanus, the founder of the Trojan people, was originally from Italy. And of course, this is Aeneas's destiny. He's going to found the Roman people in Italy. And so this is a great example of how Aeneas is trying to connect the past and the present, right? So Aeneas is not just taking his companions and his family to some random new place to start a new life. No, in a sense, he's actually returning to his homeland, okay? And I think that's an important point. So it is a kind of homecoming, but a very different kind of homecoming than that of Odysseus. Speaking of Odysseus, there are several other things in book 3 that are intended to give a very strong Homeric flavor. So some of the places and some of the things that he sees, he basically sort of travels in the footsteps of Odysseus at several points. So he sees Scylla and Charybdis. He goes by the Cyclops Island and actually sees Polyphemus, the very Cyclops that Odysseus blinded. So what is the point of book 3 since you're not reading it? What's the point of it? Well, as I just said, it gives a kind of Homeric flavor and establishes a link between Greek culture and Roman culture. And it further underlines the point that it is Aeneas's fate, his destiny, to bring his people back to Italy. So that's really what book 3 is trying to get across. All right, book 4, you're going to read about Aeneas in Carthage with Dido, and you're going to see the spectacular flame out of that relationship. So you'll read that. That's book 4. But we're skipping book 5. So what happens in book 5? Well, in book 5, they come up on shore in Sicily. Okay, so they're almost to Italy, but they're not quite there yet. At this point, Anchises, the father of Aeneas, is dead, and it's actually the 1-year anniversary of his death. So they have some funeral games, which is something that Greeks and Romans did. They're on Sicily in honor of Anchises. But here's the really the only important thing that happens in book 5 that you need to know. In book 5, Aeneas has a dream. And in this dream, Anchises appears to him and tells him to come and visit him in the underworld. Kind of a strange request, but he gives Aeneas a tantalizing little bit of information. He says, if you come and visit me in the underworld, you will see your city and your descendants. Okay. So this is why at the beginning of book 6, which you will be reading, Aeneas is coming up on shore of Italy at Cumae. He is trying to find the Sibyl, a prophetess, who will help lead him to the underworld. So it kind of explains what's going on at the beginning of book 6. And we're stopping at 6, but of course the Aeneid goes on. There are 6 more books, and I can very briefly summarize what happens in those. Remember, these are the 6 books that are modeled on the Iliad rather than the Odyssey. So Aeneas and his crew arrive in Latium. Latium is the region, well, you know what Latium is. It's the region in Italy where Rome is located. The bad news is that it's not uninhabited. There are already people there, warlike people. But he meets this princess named Lavinia. And Lavinia, he wants to marry Lavinia. But so does a local warlord named Turnus, Turnus. And so this sets up this big war between Aeneas and the Trojans and the native Italians led by Turnus. The epic ends with a kind of mano-a-mano showdown between Aeneas and Turnus. Aeneas plunges his sword right through Turnus's chest, and the epic ends. There's no further ado. Turnus is dead, stabbed by Aeneas. The end. It's a very kind of abrupt ending. And I think maybe in a way, and I'll touch on this in the next video, I think maybe in a way it kind of raises the question, okay, great. Aeneas has finally attained Italy. It's his now. But there's a pretty massive trail of blood in his wake. And the cost of this conquest has been very, very high. So was it in fact worth it in the end? And I think in a way that question is raised, in the way that the whole story ends. But I'll say more about that in the next video. There'll just be one more video. And the next video will be looking at some of the themes that come through very strongly in the Aeneid. And will also, hopefully the video will help you in starting to think about your essay for the week. So I'll see you next time.